So tonight's event is co-sponsored by the CFUW International Relations Committee and the Afghan Youth Engagement and Development Initiative. And we're joined tonight by CFUW National President Catherine Wilkinson and VP International Relations Joy Hurst. And for those of us who are new to our organization, CFUW is a self-funded, nonpartisan organization founded in 1919, and it works to improve the status of women by promoting human rights, public education, social justice, peace in Canada and abroad. And with nearly 7,000 members from across Canada, CFUW clubs and the CFUW Charitable Trust donate well over $1 million in fellowships and awards to women to pursue post-secondary education. And you can visit cfuw.org for more information about joining a club near you. And now I am going to introduce our moderator, and I'd like to just introduce tonight's co-sponsor and moderator for this event, Khalida Nasiri. She is the Executive Director of the Afghan Youth Engagement and Development Initiative, where she's responsible for overseeing the overall operations, management, and success of the group. She has an extensive background working in research, advocacy, and community organizing. This includes a local leadership program for underprivileged youth, working for a federal finance minister, serving on grassroots organizations such as Scarborough Transit Action and the Canadian Muslim Vote, representing her riding of Scarborough Guildwood for Equal Voices' historic 27 campaign, Daughters of the Vote initiative. Khalida started AYEDI because she strongly believes in the potential for Afghan Canadians to become leaders and advocates in their communities. She hopes to break down the barriers that her community encounters in accessing spaces and to express their voices and develop into leaders. Khalida is a third-year medical student at the University of Western Ontario. She has a master's in epidemiology from McGill University and has interned with the World Health Organization. We need more Khalidas. Her hobbies include reading nonfiction, taekwondo, drinking double-doubles, and traveling. Hopefully we can get back to that soon. So without further ado, Khalida, you have the floor. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Charlotte, for the introduction. And it's always a bit weird hearing your own bio being read out loud, but thank you. Hello and salam, everyone. My name is Khalida Nasiri, and like Charlotte said, I'm the Executive Director of the Afghan Youth Engagement and Development Initiative, or AYEDI for short. I want to acknowledge that AYEDI operates on the indigenous lands of the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabe-Waaki, the Haudenosaunee peoples, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. And I acknowledge that we have the privilege to function on this land because of the ongoing processes of colonialism. And we encourage each of you to maintain a critical, reflexive view of colonial institutions and structures and to confront your own position on these lands. Now, I want to talk a bit about AYEDI, and then we'll shift into kind of the event today and what it's all about. So AYEDI is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization founded in 2018. And our vision is to increase civic engagement and social development amongst Afghan Canadian youth aged 15 to 30 years old. Our organization is fully led by Afghan youth. Our main program is an Afghan youth mentorship program where we pair newcomer, refugee, and first-generation Afghan youth with Afghan mentors here in Canada to support them with school, career, and building life skills. We also do a lot of civic engagement work like voter engagement, get out the vote during election seasons. And more recently, we've gotten into the advocacy space more so out of necessity because of what's been going on in Afghanistan. And as a group of young Afghans in Canada, we stand in solidarity with the young Afghans of Afghanistan who want the same things that we do here: a chance at a brighter future, equal opportunity, and peace and justice for all. Now, Afghans are a unique diaspora because our country has been in a state of war for decades. And the unfortunate story is that people like my parents escaped Afghanistan almost 30 years ago in a similar way. They escaped to India, registered as refugees there with the UNHCR, and were accepted to Canada as refugees. And they now have to almost relive that crisis almost 30 years later. And it almost feels like history is repeating itself for the Afghan people, like nothing has changed. But at the same time, Afghans are hopeful people, and they're some of the most resilient people on this planet. And with the support of people like you at this event today, Afghanistan can have a brighter future and Afghan people can have a brighter future. Now, in August, AYEDI launched the Canadian Campaign for Afghan Peace, which was a nonpartisan campaign that represents the united voice of Afghans in Canada on demands on how we want the Afghanistan crisis to be addressed by the Canadian government. And so we engaged with all political parties on the crisis. Our campaign has been endorsed by over 50 national and international organizations like CFUW, Oxfam, Unifor, Amnesty, and the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission, which unfortunately was disbanded a few months ago because of the Taliban invasion. Now, most recently and briefly, we've been calling on the Canadian government to expedite resettlement processes to meet the quota of 40,000 refugees within 6 to 9 months and commit to increasing that number to accepting 95,000 over 24 months, to remove barriers from allocation limits imposed on SAWs or sponsorship agreement holders, and expand the category of eligible relatives of Afghan Canadians and those who supported Canada's involvement in Afghanistan, such as interpreters, to allow applications from those internally displaced within Afghanistan through assigning temporary residence permits, and assign Afghan refugees prima facie status for those who have already exited Afghanistan, to remove some of that documentation barriers to processing their applications. And finally, consulting with the Afghan Canadian community and relevant stakeholders like some of our panelists here on a regular and substantive basis in Canada's ongoing efforts towards Afghan refugee resettlement and humanitarian assistance. And that's something that we think has been missing in Canadian policy. And I'm sure we're going to talk more about that during the panel today. Now you can read more about our work at www.ayedi.ca/ccap. Now, today's panel is focused on discussing the crisis in Afghanistan from the perspectives of groups and organizations who've been involved in various capacities. We'll discuss the situation of vulnerable groups. We'll hear firsthand experiences from people and groups involved with evacuating Afghans from Afghanistan. We'll talk about barriers to safe exit and resettlement, the international community's role in addressing the crisis, and policy changes that the Canadian government needs to make to address the simultaneous humanitarian and refugee crisis of Afghanistan. And each panelist here today brings a unique and qualified perspective on all of these topics. The takeaway from today is hopefully you kind of understand what is going on in Afghanistan, what are the issues that frontline groups are facing and in protecting people, and what can we do about it as individuals, as organizations, and as a country. Now, in terms of the format, so we have several questions we'll be asking the panelists. Some are directed to all of the panelists, while others are directed to specific ones. Though if any of the panelists would like to add anything at the end of another one's remarks, you may certainly do so. We kindly ask the panelists to stay within the time limits, which I'll indicate when I ask each question. And like I mentioned earlier in the green room, I'll let you know when your time is up and give you an opportunity to kind of wrap up your thoughts. If we have some time at the end, and it looks like we might, we'll open up the floor to a Q&A. And so to the audience, feel free to ask or submit your questions using the chat function, and we'll choose a few and ask them near the end of the event if we have some time. Now, next I'll move on to introducing the panelists. Unfortunately, Ali Mirzad from the Canadian Hazara Humanitarian Services is not able to make it today because of a family emergency, and our thoughts are with him and his family. I'm going to share my screen. You can see this. You see this? Great.
Perfect.
Cool. So we'll start off with Ambassador Hassan Soroush. So the ambassador has been in Ottawa since September 2019. He presented his credentials to Her Excellency, the Right Honorable Julie Payette, Governor General and Commander-in-Chief of Canada on November 1st, 2019, then Governor General, accrediting him as Ambassador of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan to Canada. Ambassador Soroush has represented Afghanistan at various bilateral, trilateral, and regional working committees and commissions, as well as regional and international conferences and meetings, including high-level negotiations on outcome documents and resolutions pertaining to various national, regional, and international issues. The ambassador holds a Master of Arts in Public Policy, International Development Studies from the Japanese National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, and has conducted research on a variety of topics, including on regional economic cooperation issues. Ambassador Surush is married and has one son and one daughter. Next, we have Victoria Johish from the Afghan Women's Centre of Montreal. She's the executive director. With a background in medicine, she has volunteered countless hours of her time to supporting AWCM's mission. She's a committed advocate for immigrant women's rights. After going through a similar immigration path, she developed a firsthand understanding of the real challenges faced by the newly arrived newcomers. In addition, Victoria has participated in other nonprofit organizations with a similar mission to bring up the immigrant families' concerns by collaborating on legal information about family violence education in Quebec. She also engaged with the foundation Hope for Tomorrow, which enabled her to use her knowledge of 4 languages to work with Shriner Hospital for Children and Montreal Children's Hospital. Basir Bida from the Canadian Women for Women Afghanistan holds a bachelor's degree in literature. Basir has worked for a wide array of national and international development projects over the last few years, including as a communications specialist at Canadian Women for Women Afghanistan on their UNESCO project, Getting Girls Back to School After COVID. He has translated several books, including Civil Resistance Tactics in the 21st Century. Basir is a peace and nonviolence activist, an advocate for gender equality, and a proponent of LGBT rights. And last but definitely not least, we have Tim Laidler, founder and president, Veterans Transition Network. Corporal Tim Laidler is the executive director of the Institute of Veterans Education and Transition at the University of British Columbia and a leading voice for veterans. He completed a tour of duty in Afghanistan before completing a master's degree in counseling, spurred by a transformative group counseling program still in development at UBC. In 2012, he helped establish the Veterans Transition Network to deliver that powerful program to veterans across Canada. He remains an active board president of VTN and leads the charity's ground operation and government battle to bring Afghan interpreters to safety. That tough mission continues, and we definitely agree it's been a tough mission. So now with that being said, we'll start the panel officially. I'm not sure if we're going to spotlight all the speakers at once or as they speak. Okay, I see a thumbs up from Charlotte, so they'll kind of deal with that. So the first question kind of sets the scene about the organizations and gives the audience more information about each one of you and your work. So could each of you talk about your organization's work prior to the August crisis, and what activities has your organization been doing since then with respect to the crisis? You each have about 5 minutes, and we can start with Victoria.
Thank you, Khalida. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. I just want to make sure that everyone, do you hear me well, right? Perfect. Excellent. So I want to introduce the Afghan Women's Center's mission in brief. The AWCM's mission is to empower socially isolated immigrant women within Montreal through creating programs according to their needs, facilitating self-development workshops, and promoting team-based projects. We seek to fully integrate these women into our community, both economically and socially. Our goal is to provide opportunities for women falling into the minority groups and to improve their welfare through community engagement. And understanding and responding to the vulnerability of our seniors, we offer intergenerational activities such as social exchange, transfer of skills, and creating opportunities to develop leadership roles. As well as cultural exchange is critical in the integration of people to a new environment. That's why we also foster cultural initiatives such as cooking classes, featuring traditional Afghani foods, and as well as other cultural events. So these instances serve to embed Afghan culture into the Montreal community while helping our members cope with the cultural shock that follows after resettlement. In Afghanistan, there are multiple factors affecting women and girls under the Taliban regime. For example, the Taliban have stated that women could participate in the community, but only within the limit of their interpretation of Sharia law. New strict gender restrictions have severely limited the ability of many young women to pursue a meaningful education. Women aid workers are banned from working in the middle of a humanitarian and economic crisis, as well as women groups are intimidated and threatened. So most women stay hidden in their home, afraid of going out. Like last night, for example, we had a meeting with a few women currently living in Afghanistan who provided some testimonies about the severity of the Taliban policies. One woman shared with us that each time she went out, she was stopped by Taliban asking for the official documents or requesting her some documents. And she was told she could not go out unless accompanied by her husband. The majority also feel discouraged because they don't have access to job anymore. Women formerly active in the civil society and undertaking professions currently limited to men are threatened and remain hidden, desperately seeking a way out of the country. After taking all power, the Taliban developed a communication strategy seeking to soften their image. However, as we have seen, these declarations are mostly a smokescreen. In the Afghan Women's Centre of Montreal, when the news broke in August, we relived the trauma of past years filled with fears and deceptions. We immediately raised concern for women, girls, and targeted minorities in the country. Our priority was to make sure they were safe, and we wanted a powerful state to help them leave. In a concrete way, we have been addressing the griefness of civilians in Afghanistan and Montreal. For example, in December 2021, we sent donation to Kabul, help about 40 low-income, or I would say vulnerable Afghan families. And simultaneously, we have welcomed part of the large wave of Afghan refugees who arrived in Montreal, offering them access to our center's activities and services, such as language courses and access to the internet and laptops. And the result was very positive. Our advocacy work also includes different conferences to raise awareness about their concerns. We, by providing the mental health release sessions, the AWCM provided to the families arriving in Quebec administrative assistance as well, legal references, launching info sessions about job opportunities and financial literacies. We're also in contact with some public and private actors who are able to sponsor some of the vulnerable families from Afghanistan. And recently, we've been in contact with the Quebec government to resettle families from the 200 refugees that landed in Vancouver last week. We also launched some new projects in Afghanistan to empower Afghan women's skills, such as embroidery workshops for women, and the AWCM provided them with financial assistance to be able to run that project. And finally, today we continue to participate in different webinars, conferences across Canada and globally to raise awareness about the rights of Afghan women and girls in Afghanistan.
Thank you very much, Victoria John, and hearing those stories and what you say about the trauma that's kind of being relived, it resonated with me a lot, and setting the scene for what girls and women in Afghanistan are going through and the amazing work you folks are doing. So thank you. We'll move on now to Tim. You have 5 minutes.
Hello, thank you. So yeah, the history of the Veterans Transition Network, as mentioned in the bio, it basically runs a traditional group counseling program for veterans transitioning out of the military. After my tour in Afghanistan in 2008, I was lucky enough to come back to UBC, where I was finishing off my undergraduate degree, and met a professor, Dr. Marv Westwood, who had created this 10-day transition program for veterans. I took part in it myself, and it was quite life-changing. It taught us all about the role emotions play, how we need to suppress them in times of conflict and war, and especially in the military, and how that can be very counterproductive when you're transitioning back into civilian life. So that inspired me to get more involved and ultimately help launch the Veterans Transition Network as a charity and bring that program across Canada. Fast forwarding to the summer of 2021, we were in full swing running our veterans programs, and we start hearing from our interpreters and other veterans about the issues happening in Afghanistan. So our attention started to move towards potentially doing something as a charity. And with August coming so quick and surprising everyone, we got thrown into the mix alongside a number of other groups and veterans, and basically responded to the requests of the Afghan interpreters who were here in Canada, who were calling the veterans they worked with, and including interpreters and people we knew in Afghanistan who were calling veterans, who all started calling our NGO and asking, is there anything we can do? Can we help? And we came up with a mission in August to create a network of safe houses in Afghanistan. Met some other groups along the way that were doing similar, and all kind of started working side by side to find a way to keep people safe, to inject over, now today it's been almost $3 million we sent into Afghanistan for life support and evacuations. I can say that the passion that veterans have for those they served with was evident from our social media and from the letters we were receiving, and we've moved full programming over to support that mission. It wouldn't have happened without the advocacy from the veterans themselves and from the interpreters. And as an organization, what we did at the VTN was we recognized that Afghan interpreters would often wear Canadian Forces uniforms. And in our charitable mandate, we said we're there to help men and women who wear the uniform, and therefore we were able to categorize interpreters and their families as veterans and provide this support. It's most likely just going to be a temporary measure as we try and help people out in the later stages. As many people know, it's becoming increasingly difficult to move out of the country without proper travel documents, passports, visas, and the process has definitely slowed, but we are seeing incremental gains. And we are hopeful, though, with the right advocacy, some potentially changes in policies, and most importantly, reopening some sort of consular presence to support travel documents for people to get outside the country. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. And I'm looking forward to breaking kind of some of the pieces that you said a bit down more throughout our conversation today. We'll move on now to Ambassador Hassan.
Of course, thank you, Salam. Good evening to everyone. I'm very much pleased to be part of this very timely conversation on Afghanistan. And I wish to thank the Canadian Federation for University Women and the Afghan Youth Engagement and Development Initiative for co-organizing this webinar and for the opportunity to speak this evening. The past 5 months have been very much challenging and stressful, both for our fellow Afghans and friends of Afghanistan. And many of us are still in the state of shock because of what happened so quickly and tragically in Afghanistan. The unconstitutional seizure of power by the Taliban was basically a very tragic turning point, causing a huge disruption to constitutional order, provision of public services and international engagement in Afghanistan, resulting basically in one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world. A free fall in our economy with a GDP contraction of an estimated 40%, and a growing number of people in conditions of high vulnerability. Various types of human rights violations, including restrictions on women and girls, retaliatory detentions, forced disappearance of women activists and members of security and defense forces continue to take place in various parts of Afghanistan, and the majority of them even do not make news headlines. The Taliban's performance over the past 5 months, including with respect to their capacity to govern and their overall human rights performance, has only added to public mistrust, uncertainty, and disappointment. And this sense of uncertainty and fear has been basically driving people to get out of the country. And of course, it's quite clear for all of us that there are many people who face serious threat, remain at high risk, and require protection. Of course, discussing the root causes of and the catalyst for the Taliban takeover would certainly require a dedicated panel discussion and goes beyond the agenda of today's webinar. Just very briefly on our current priorities at the embassy. Like many other Afghan entities, the work of our embassies has also been impacted by the Taliban takeover. Since mid-August, we have basically stopped communications with Kabul. As in our view, the Taliban as the de facto authorities lack the legitimacy, and as I said, they unconstitutionally seized power. And in addition to this, their approach to many critical issues such as women's rights, inclusion, education, and international relations is incompatible with our shared values and international norms. In terms of priorities, prior to the Taliban takeover, our priorities included many important areas such as strategic partnership, security sector support, development cooperation, trade and investment, women's empowerment, and cultural diplomacy, among other activities. However, in response to the new realities and basically needs, we have brought some adjustments to our work plan. Our focus has shifted towards new priorities, new and emerging priorities, including humanitarian assistance, human rights issues, and the resettlement related issues, including the provision of consular services to the newcomers. We have also continued our diplomatic and advocacy efforts through continued collaboration and conversation with our Canadian and international partners. The embassy has also been active under the group of Afghan missions. We have issued a number of joint statements sharing the growing concerns about the future of Afghanistan and calling for scaled up and expedited international response to the overall situation in Afghanistan. We have also been advocating for an international monitoring system for the oversight of human rights situation in Afghanistan. On different occasions, we have also shared our perspectives and ideas and suggestions with our Canadian and international partners with the view to help expedite the overall evacuation and resettlement efforts. Despite a severe resource constraint, our consular section here in Ottawa and also our consulates in Toronto and Vancouver have continued their operations, providing various types of consular services to the broader Afghan community and more specifically to the newcomers. Our colleagues have also been very active in terms of communicating the newcomers basically needs, including immediate needs with the relevant departments here in Canada, as well as with various networks of volunteers. And I must say that the amount of sympathy and support that we have been receiving, both from the Canadian government and from Friends of Afghanistan here in Canada, has been very much encouraging for us. As you know, for 2 decades, Canada was one of the largest donors to Afghanistan, providing assistance to many important areas such as education, health, women's empowerment, and security sector. Many men and women from Canada, from the Canadian Armed Forces, made the ultimate sacrifice alongside our security and defense forces in defense of our shared values, for which we are enormously grateful. Since mid-August, as Canada has...
You have about a minute left if you'd like to finish your thought.
Thank you. Since mid-August, Canada has remained active in support of the people of Afghanistan, participating at various international conferences on Afghanistan. And as we all know, the Canadian government announced a new funding in support of basically the overall humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan. And politically speaking, Canada was one of the first countries, if not the first country, to announce that it would not recognize the Taliban as a government. So this principled position, along with the Canadian leadership role in humanitarian assistance, and also when it comes to the resettlement program, are indicative of Canada's continued commitment to the people of Afghanistan, for which we are very much grateful. And also, it's also a clear indication of Canada's commitment to our shared values, which continue to guide our collective efforts, and also the continued collaboration and conversation between the embassy and our international, our Canadian partners. I'll stop here, but I'll be very happy to elaborate more on the resettlement program and the overall humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan during the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, very much for your remarks. And finally, we'll move on to Basir from a Canadian Woman for Women in Afghanistan.
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak and share my experience in today's event. CWU is an organization with profoundly sustainable social change through education. It has been working in solidarity with Afghan women and communities in Afghanistan to defend human rights, especially the right to gender equitable education for women and girls since 1994. The program areas it focuses include investing in basic education, community literacy and libraries, technology for education, public engagement, and advocacy in Canada. I became involved with CWU as the critical thinking and creativity trainer back in 2014, and continued my work voluntarily as a translator for its online library and an employee, where I deepened my understanding of educational needs, the situation of women and girls, and other challenges they face in Afghan society. I would like to elaborate on CWU's activities on the grounds and how those activities put me at risk and resulted in me being eligible for asylum visa status. The work I was engaged with deeply relates to educational programs and projects for women and girls, teaching critical thinking skills to teachers, training colleges, and one all-girls school, organizing campaigns to promote girls' education and their access to educational opportunities, implementing policies on gender equality in education institutions are all efforts that clash with Taliban's ideologies. On the one hand, I should take the opportunity to emphasize on the importance of CWU's work on the ground. I worked for a dozen of local and international organizations, but CWU's work is outstanding and lasting in terms of the effects it has had on girls and women. Because of the impactful nature of CWU's activities in the capital and provinces of Afghanistan, I and my other colleagues faced tremendously heavy threats by Taliban. As far as how the voices of Afghans have informed our work, we are in constant contact with Afghans on the ground who are experiencing the crisis firsthand, particularly women and girls whose human rights have been severely restricted. As with all our programs, it's their voices, human experiences and demands that shape our work and recommendations to Government of Canada and other decision makers. We continue to receive many dozens of requests every week from desperate Afghans afraid for their safety and looking for support to leave the country, particularly journalists, women's rights activists, and civil society actors. As far as the activities CWU has been doing since fall of Kabul, I would like to say that many of our programs have been adapted or uninterrupted despite the rise of Taliban, especially our Tech for Education program, and that demand for these programs has extremely grown. We have also responded with humanitarian aid to the emergency needs of IDPs, distributing learning baskets containing educational materials for children, as well as staple foods, warm blankets, and hygiene kits for those living in camps. Our advocacy program has been very active in Canada and internationally, including many media engagements by our senior staff, Lauren Mawarid, meetings with IRCC and Government of Canada agencies, coordination and support for wider efforts with partners like VTN and others to support safe passage for vulnerable Afghans. We have also developed and shared numerous advocacy tools for concerned Canadians to use, and my colleague Sarah Keeler will introduce some new tools for advocacy with IRCC at the end of the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Basir, and it's great to hear that programming is still, Canadian Women for Women's programming is still kind of ongoing in Afghanistan. Certainly it's needed now more than ever in recent history. So now we'll move on to kind of questions directed at specific panelists. And Basir, actually, the first question is for you. So, you know, we kind of want to tell a story. So we'll start with talking about evacuation, and we'll move on to like resettlement needs a bit later in the conversation. Now, what was your experience evacuating from Afghanistan, and how was a Canadian charity like Canadian Women for Women able to facilitate your exit? And feel free to also talk about, you know, barriers you face that you think should be removed.
Sure. My experience evacuating from Afghanistan was horrendous, as thousands of others experienced. I gave 8 attempts along with my family to get into Kabul airports, but all failed. I managed to fly from Afghanistan to Pakistan with direct support of CW. Without CW and its country director in particular, I would be still stuck in Afghanistan. In order to relieve the suffering and subsequent PTSD, I started writing the story of my journey since fall of Kabul until the first week after I arrived in Canada, and I plan to publish it soon. As far as CW facilitating evacuation, my affiliation and my colleagues with our work put me at heightened risk and made me eligible for SIM. CW has been actively working to advocate for staff, though most of our colleagues remain in Afghanistan, waiting to be processed by IRCC. So far, only me and another colleague made it to Canada. I was beaten, lashed, searched, slapped, and kicked by the Taliban. In relation to the question on policy and what barriers should be removed or policy changes, CW would like to see. There are 4 main recommendations CW has for Canadian government, including alternative travel documents, regional hub, student visa waivers, and UNHCR status. Thank you.
Wow, thank you for sharing that, Basir John. And it's really great to hear that there are groups, you know, like Canadian Women for Women out there supporting the exit of Afghans who really need that. And that sounds like, you know, obviously a horrible experience. And it's one of many experiences that a lot of Afghans are still going through right now. It's a reality for people there, even though it seems like it's something far away. And so for people like you, hearing stories from people like you, hopefully people can feel a bit closer and see that reality happening. Now the next question I will ask Tim actually, and then I have a question for the ambassador, but we'll start with Tim. Now, the Veterans Transition Network was part of a veteran-led initiative to safely evacuate 1,892 Afghan interpreters, civilians, and their families who supported Canada's mission. Can you elaborate on, you know, in your experience on who has been able to leave and who's staying behind, who is included and excluded in the current, the Canadian government's current plans? And from your perspective, what responsibility does Canada have to those partners who remain in Afghanistan or neighboring countries? A lot of questions there, but yeah, well, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I can start by saying absolutely. Canada is responsible for all the people that took part and supported our mission. As I mentioned, we started primarily with the interpreters, because they were at heightened risk, because they were wearing our uniforms. And there have been numerous reports of interpreters being targeted, even while Canada still had its military in Afghanistan. So we knew that that was a risk, population at risk. But then what we also started to realize is many of the NGO employees were required to go on to military bases to conduct meetings and different sorts of things. And people watching the bases wouldn't be able to tell who was an interpreter, who was a locally employed staff, or who was working for an NGO. And this, the risk to the whole population just grew that way. So we've been, proud to support a much broader population in the end. I think probably the most frustrating thing we've seen about who's able to make it out and who's stuck behind is the fact that I'll just use my own example. There's 5 people that I was very close with that I wrote letters for, a reference letter for, and I used basically almost an identical letter because we had the very similar service to each other. 3 of those people are in Canada now, and 2 of them have not heard back from IRCC. The 2 that have not heard back, I've called several times, like many other veterans have. We followed up, we get through to the phone number to hear, all that we hear is that they do not have an application in the system. We resubmitted it multiple times. And this is, I think, one of the most frustrating pieces is that there seems to be no fairness in this process. It's just, I think we can all imagine just how many hundreds of thousands of emails IRCC has received, and the process of sorting through that much data, it's obviously caused this issue. So continued advocacy is needed to make sure that people can get G numbers, can get the SIM approval. People might be familiar with the US, they call it SIV in the US. Everyone's trying to get an SIV approval. In Canada, you're trying to get an SIM approval. And ultimately we get a G number that would allow you to be evacuated by land or by air. And I would just echo one of the points brought up by the Canadian Women for Women on the establishment of a regional hub. I think this is essential because this process is not going to go quickly, and pulling people to a safe location where they can continue to work for NGOs, continue to draw salaries outside of Afghanistan without the fear that some of that income tax is going to go to the Taliban, and they can have their family safe while this paperwork gets sorted out. I think that's an essential next step in this evacuation. Thanks.
Tim, you make some great points there, and mentioning the US program too. And I was wondering, you mentioned, so you've written a few letters for some folks who need it. Do you think that's, a necessary thing right now with the urgency of the crisis, provide this documentation first? And what other specific documents are needed aside from a letter? Like, do people need to show like work IDs, and has there been other issues with presenting documentation like passports and things like that in your experience?
Yep, for sure. For the application process, they do need identification documents. Proofs of the letters we write are the proof of service, the verification of service letters. When it comes to the evacuation, there was a number of people who were able to get out in the early days without passports. That, for the most part, has ended, and IRCC has put that message out recommending all Afghans attain the appropriate travel documents before leaving the country, as it's causing problems where people are stuck in Pakistan, for example, without a passport or a valid visa, and now they're in fear of being deported or detained. So it is, and this brings up one of the other points about reopening some sort of consular presence, allowing people to get biometrics in country so that they can get alternative travel documents. This would be a game changer, as would open up air evacuations, and other countries, other land border countries would potentially be an option as well if they have that proper travel document that allows them to go all the way to Canada.
Great, thank you. And part of that question came from just my experiences with family back home, where people sometimes don't have passports, or their tazkira, like their official IDs. It's just a thing with Afghans sometimes. So definitely interesting to hear your experiences there. Now the next question is for Ambassador Hassan. So according to aid agencies, over 23 million people in Afghanistan, which is over 2/3 of the country, face severe hunger, and nearly 9 million are at high risk of severe starvation. Now, in your experience and your expertise, what role does the international community have to play in the humanitarian response for those in Afghanistan? And kind of a second question is, what is the status of recent discussions on calls for the US to unfreeze Afghan government funds to prevent the economy from collapsing, which would certainly further worsen the crisis? And does Canada have a role to play kind of in that conversation?
Thank you. As I said earlier, in terms of gravity, Afghanistan is basically facing one of the worst and fastest growing humanitarian crisis globally. And addressing this crisis with this scale requires scaling up and basically accelerating international response. Thanks to the generous support provided last year, including by Canada, the Afghanistan humanitarian program under the United Nations was basically the best funded appeal globally. This year, according to the United Nations, and as we just mentioned rightly, 2/3 of the population will basically depend on life-saving and food assistance. Therefore, the United Nations in this context basically launched the largest ever single country appeal 2 weeks ago, which includes $4.4 billion to assist more than 22 million people, including children, with food and healthcare, as well as with livelihoods and other life-saving assistance. The United Nations also launched yesterday the One UN Transitional Engagement Framework, seeking an additional $3.6 billion, mainly focusing on immediate development priorities, including education, health, community infrastructure, social cohesion, and also saving livelihoods, with a very special focus on the socioeconomic needs of women and girls. However, as we have long argued, aid needs to be channeled directly to the vulnerable people back in Afghanistan, including through independent local and international organizations, including UN agencies, to basically ensure effectiveness and also to avoid any kind of misappropriation or diversion of aid. So this is a very important, basically, point. And also it's very important to make sure that aid will not be used by the Taliban to consolidate their power or to be used as a tool for legitimization by the Taliban. In the meantime, of course, as highlighted by the United Nations, there is a need for a more flexible approach when it comes to using donor fund for some emerging and new priorities, like paying salaries for teachers, health workers, and other workers or providers of basically essential services. As you know, last December, a humanitarian exemption resolution was adopted by the United Nations Security Council, and the United States also issued a number of new licenses to basically further facilitate humanitarian activities. We have been also calling, along with other colleagues from other Afghan missions, for creative solutions with a view to avoid an economic collapse, including in terms of, for instance, helping increase liquidity in Afghanistan and also increasing the purchasing power of people. Of course, there have also been ideas and recommendations coming from the expert community regarding, for instance, expanding sanctions relief and gradual release of foreign exchange reserves. But the principle of conditionality remains very important. And of course, we do believe that this principle needs to be pursued very wisely and effectively without causing any delays when it comes to aid delivery, and also without legitimizing the Taliban. So there are efforts to, at this point, at an expert level, to see, or there are basically efforts to explore ways to, under a phased approach, or under a gradual approach, to help release at least part of the frozen funds and assets. And a good example is also the recent decision within the ARTF, Afghanistan Reconstruction Fund, under the World Bank, to release part of the previously earmarked aid, and basically giving them to UNICEF and WFP. So that was a very good starting point, but of course that's not sufficient. There are ongoing efforts, and we hope that with a very due attention to the principle of conditionality, there will be ways to help this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you. And I know it's a tough situation to be in, right? Because people need help, but then you also don't want to inadvertently provide kind of financial funds to the Taliban and all of that. So it's definitely not a straightforward kind of answer, a clear answer, and definitely has to be an issue that's approached with nuance. Okay, the next question is for all the panelists. So we're shifting more into policy, and a few of you have touched a bit about kind of changes you want to see. So as we all know, government policy on Afghanistan resettlement has been slow, and there's not been a lot of communication and information. And so what are some key policy changes that you and your organization wants to see that would have an impact for Afghans who need to exit or have exited Afghanistan? And what are you hearing from clients, friends, or family members back home with regards to changes that need to be done? So I'll open up the floor to whoever wants to go first. And if you could keep your responses to 2 or 3 minutes, that would be helpful.
Can I go first?
Go for
Thank
it.
you. Perfect. Thank you so much, Khalida John. So in terms of the policy, like, we believe the Canadian policy is blocked by bureaucratic roadblocks and lack of resources to effectively process demands in time. So these shortcomings are evident when compared to the Syrian case back in 2016. So for instance, eligibility criteria are exceedingly narrow and leaving out groups that face great danger. Like, furthermore, the IRCC embraced the sponsorship agreement holder as an efficient vehicle for bringing Afghans to Canada now. However, we believe this process to be discriminatory and that it will profoundly change the status of the refugees. And in addition, the lack of diplomatic presence in Afghanistan means that there are like no guarantees that Afghans who meet these criteria are able to leave. This problem has been further exacerbated by numerous delays in obtaining accords with other countries. So for instance, many Afghan refugees living in Pakistan, Tajikistan, or Qatar are facing deportations. In the meantime, while the Canadian government has declared that these accords are underway, there has been no concrete proof to date. So we call for the Canadian government to exercise its leverage in order to pressure the Taliban to allow individuals at risk, including vulnerable minorities, to safely exit Afghanistan. And moreover, we call the Canadian government both to clarify and to expand refugee eligibility criteria. So this policy based on the principle of utility rather than compassion ends up being discriminatory and slow the whole evacuation process. For example, in the Syrian case back in 2016, there was no eligibility criteria for refugees, which results in a much faster and more efficient evacuation process. And finally, Canada must waive the requirement of UNHCR recognition and recognize the Afghan crisis as a prime facie refugee situation. So once out of their home country, refugees cannot simply apply to other countries for resettlements. Instead, they must be referred usually by United Nations agencies, and this process can take several years. So there's a clear shortage of processing capacity to match both the magnitude and urgency which the current situation requires. By reducing or eliminating bureaucratic barriers, the Canadian government can speed up the process of resettlement such that its promised goal of 40,000 comes sooner than 2 years be realized that we wish.
Thank you, Victoria John, for that elaboration, and definitely that point about assigning kind of prima facie status, for people outside of Afghanistan is something that I've heard echoed in several different advocacy circles, and it's something that I think a lot of people can agree on. Okay, I'll open it up to any other panelists who would like to talk about policy changes they want to see.
I can offer some policy options. I think I also wanted to say I get some questions in the comments, so I'll maybe just address first, and just some general statements about the evacuation failing, and I think that is an accurate assessment. We've said 40,000 as a country. We've promised that. We've given hope to a lot of people, and I believe the number is approximately 6,000 have actually made it to Canada. So that needs to change. We do need to attack this with urgency, as we do know that there's some areas you feel like there's a bit of a lull, but we don't know how long that will last for. We definitely know there's cases of people being targeted and abused. So we do want to move quickly. One really tangible, useful thing I can offer for anybody who's trying to get someone out of Afghanistan and trying to get them their G number, get them their SIM approval. The one effective way we have seen is going through your local member of parliament. So if you're a Canadian, whatever riding that you're living in, look up your local member of parliament and schedule a meeting with them and bring them the documents and the case files of the person you're trying to assist. And that member of parliament has the ability to call the Ministry of Immigration, IRCC, on behalf of that person, on behalf of you as their constituent. We have seen that getting some extra attention, and sometimes they are able to get more feedback on the steps and where their process are at for their application. So I definitely encourage anybody trying to get those G numbers to take that. And it also keeps this issue front of mind for the member of parliament. That was my piece. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Tim, for that very practical advice. And we often forget that federal members of parliament, one of their responsibilities is kind of managing cases, and they have caseworkers and they work on that. So definitely use that resource. Ambassador Hassan, I saw you unmuted yourself, so I'll pass it on to you next.
Oh, thank you. First, I thank the government of Canada for showing leadership and initiating and then expanding the resettlement program for Afghanistan. On the implementation part, as you just mentioned, the overall process has been very slow, not only here in Canada, but in many other resettlement countries as well. And I think better coordination at different levels, improved processing capacity, and simplified procedures are required basically in some areas. On evacuation, for instance, evacuation itself is a very challenging task requiring basically coordination and logistics at different levels. It's even more challenging when it comes to Afghanistan, given the overall circumstances, including the very rapidly changing requirements put in place by the Taliban vis-a-vis evacuation. Sometimes they seem to be more flexible and more open. But in some cases, as experience shows, they've been very much reluctant to cooperate. So in this context, I think maintaining pressure on the Taliban under a coordinated approach by our international partners to respect freedom of movement. I agree with increasing the number of or the frequency of commercial flights from Afghanistan. And this can be done including through, for instance, operationalizing major airports in Afghanistan, because currently only Kabul airport and Mazar Sharif airport are operationalized. And also putting pressure on them in terms of ensuring safe passage to the neighboring countries. And of course, as I said, this requires joint messaging and also coordinated efforts on the part of our international partners. In the meantime, I think working with our neighboring countries with a view to convince them to pursue a more flexible approach in terms of accepting and accommodating people at risk during the transition period is very important. Increasing the processing capacity in our neighboring countries, in all countries in the region, is another important priority that needs to be addressed. And finally, I think further diversifying pathways to Canada. Maybe we can replicate some of the good experiences when it comes to the Syrian refugees, as it was mentioned earlier. Increasing the number of referral partners while helping them improve their capacity, because some of them, some of the current referral partners do not have the capacity to process the applications and to refer them to the government here. And as I said, and also further simplifying the procedures, I think will certainly help expedite the overall process. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, for those important points. And Basir, I want to give you an opportunity, though I know Canadian Women for Women will be speaking at the end as well, but certainly if you'd like to add anything or echo anything that's been said, please feel free to do so.
Thank you. For this question, I would like to pass the floor to my colleague, Sarah Killer, who will provide some resources for all audience to leave the webinar and take action in their communities and their networks. Thank you.
Sarah, I'm not sure if I don't see you, but did you want to do that now or did you want to do that near the end? It's up to you.
I think we've got some time allocated at the close of the session. So so as not to disrupt the flow of the discussion, I'll leave it for then. Thanks.
Great, no problem. And we'll be sure to pass it on to you near the end there. So moving right along, next question is for Victoria. So what are you seeing in terms of services? So now we're talking about kind of when people get here in Canada, what services are most urgently needed, particularly for Afghan women and girls and children, and families who arrive in Canada?
Yeah, we've been thinking about that. So there are multiple barriers to their integration, especially in Quebec, the province in which our center operates. First, the language is an important factor of isolation. Indeed, Afghan women will have to start from scratch by learning both French and English languages, which are essential to be able to work here and to gain financial independence and to be socially integrated in the Quebec society. Integration into the host society without knowing its languages cuts refugees off from social and economic opportunities, including friendships. So that is why the Afghan Women's Center of Montreal has been dispensing English and French classes to Afghan women in order to give them the tools to navigate Montreal and Quebec autonomously. Digital literacy also helps integration by offering new tools to find a job and communicate with people within or outside of Canada. So there are, therefore, the Afghan Women Center has been dispensing computer lessons as well. Furthermore, in Quebec, the Bill 21 is deeply discriminatory for Muslim women. Bill 21 prohibits the display of religious symbols by government employees in a position of coercive authority, as well as by teachers in the public school system. So Afghan women will have to deal with institutional racism, Islamophobia, and xenophobia. This exacerbates the cultural shock they suffer, which can be deeply demanding and prevent them from completing their integration process. In order to support immigrant women throughout their integration in Quebec, we offer mental health work sessions in which Afghan women and other racialized immigrant women can share their concerns and lived experiences about their lives back in Afghanistan or here in Quebec. Governments should work conjointly with NGOs and health organizations to expand these kind of services and supports. That would be one of our suggestions. And housing, daycare, and schoolings are important challenges for Afghan refugees, and especially for women refugees. First and foremost, considering the current housing crisis in Canada, major cities, finding reliable quality housing for Afghan families is essential. And proximity in small spaces accompanied by stress, anxiety, and fear could have an impact on the mental health of Afghan women. So Afghan women need, I believe, need time and mental space to focus on their integration and settlement. Therefore, schooling for girls and boys must be a top priority. Their education must not be delayed any further. In addition, childcare and schooling give mothers the time, energy, and space to take care of themselves. Just to summarize, understanding the cultural shock of those who arrive from Afghanistan and the trauma they've been through, as well as the material constraints they face in the first step to respond to their needs, providing them with tools for their integration, both material and non-material, is the next step to ensure a better resettlement for now.
Thank you, Victoria, for that overview. And that was very comprehensive and definitely, you know, the first couple of months or even like maybe year or two is so important when people come to Canada. It's like it sets the tone for whether they think they fit here, how they view the country and their place here. And so it's so important to give them the material support they need, like housing, food, and all of that. But then also you talk a lot about mental health and trauma, and we forget that, right? But they're coming from a lot of trauma, and so that support is certainly definitely needed. Okay, did any of the other panelists want to add anything just around that topic of resettlement needs? Just give a moment to see if anyone wants to add anything. If not, we'll move on. Okay, we'll move right along. So this is kind of moving on to now taking action. So this is a question to all the panelists, and then we do have some time, and so we'll answer some of the questions in the chat as well afterwards. To the panelists and to the audience here, we may allow the event to run a bit over time, maybe 5-10 minutes. I hope that's okay with particularly the panelists as well, if that's okay, because it looks like we do have some good questions here. And for those of you who can't stay afterwards, to the audience, like Charlotte mentioned, the event will be recorded, so you can certainly access the remainder of the discussion online. So what are two things, and this is to all the panelists, and one or two things, because people kind of like to see clear actions, that people here today and those of us in Canada can do to take action on this issue? And so some of you may have already touched on this, and you can reiterate or re-summarize action items you've already suggested. So I'll open it up to the panelists, whoever wants to go first.
Maybe I'm gonna just jump and highlight a couple of things quickly, if I may. Thank you. I believe, the first thing which everyone can do is to inform ourselves and spread awareness. The situation evolves every day, and we are still assessing the impact of the Taliban's regime. So knowing the right facts and sharing them with our family, friends, and community help maintain the flow of the information and prevents the Afghan crisis from losing attention from the international communities. And the second thing is to donate to organizations like those that are represented here today. Nonprofit and advocacy organizations are essential to defend refugees' rights and provide them with the tools necessary to survive and adapt. By donating, you are offering an organization the possibility of improving its infrastructure, expanding its tool of services, coordinating and sending help where it is most needed. And we count on everyone and profoundly appreciate everyone's donation. But above all, it is the people that we are able to help that would benefit the most. This that I wanted to add.
Thank you. No, it's really important. We often forget donations are such a small thing. They might seem small, but it goes a long way for organizations.
Exactly.
Okay, I'll open it up to the other panelists, whoever wants to go next.
Thank you. On the overall support to Afghanistan, I believe that first we all need to be part of joint messaging, countering the narrative of hopelessness and helplessness. So this is very important, especially in the context of addressing a growing sense of abandonment among people back in Afghanistan. So in this context, it's very important that we send a strong message of commitment and engagement in support of the people of Afghanistan. We need to give people back in Afghanistan hope about the future, and they need to feel basically the sympathy and commitment that exists on the part of international partners in terms of staying in solidarity with them. In terms of urgency and even the scale of humanitarian, even the fact that the scale of humanitarian crisis is far too great, helping vulnerable families, including through fundraising activities here in Canada. It's very important, and I believe that with the new exemptions in place, it's now much easier to send personal remittances to Afghanistan. So this is, I think, one of the most effective way to support vulnerable families in Afghanistan. Helping with the advocacy efforts in support of civil society activists, women and girls. I think it's another important priority for all of us. And I think we must not forget that there is a large civil society back in Afghanistan with courageous women and girls and activists from across the country. And this is an important part of our basically joint legacy for the past 2 decades. So they deserve support. And it's our moral obligation that we support them, we further enable and empower them to basically to be the voice of people in Afghanistan. And finally, more specifically, assisting with some dedicated initiatives like online education. And fundraising for dedicated scholarship programs for women and girls, I think is another important priority and remains very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Those are definitely really important points that I hope the audience takes away, especially the point about giving hope to the people of Afghanistan. I'll open it up to Tim if you would like to go next.
Sure, thanks. I do see that more and more there needs to be a need and a focus on everybody left in Afghanistan. The vast majority of the population is obviously there and is going to be there, and we need to look at the humanitarian crisis that's going forward. Supporting organizations again like Canadian Women for Women and others here on this panel that are still still looking at running programs and applying for international funds and find solutions to complex problems, and how can you employ people in Afghanistan while there's this interim authority, and still stay within the international laws. It's an extremely complex challenge for an NGO, and the infrastructure needs are exponential now with the amount you have to spend on insurance and legal work. So again, that's needed. Something simple that I find it's always we all remind ourselves is on social media, liking posts, resharing, keeping that content engagement going on this issue. That doesn't necessarily fix anything on its own, but it does, I find, draw lots of media attention. When we see lots of things trending on Twitter, journalists are right there writing articles after, and that's getting that into the decision makers' minds, continually reminding them. And if you know of an Afghan who's recently landed and resettled, I do encourage once again to take that person down to the local member of parliament's office and just have them tell a story like we heard here today. It goes a long way to make an emotional impact on a politician. Seeing someone face to face and hearing their story, it greatly increases the odds that politician back in Ottawa seeing the Minister of Immigration or Defense or somebody and just bringing this up once again. It's really a powerful tool that we have at our disposal here in Canada.
Thank you, Tim. Definitely all of those things are important. And Sarah, I don't know if you, if we can go to the Q&A and then come back and completely pass the floor on to you for your calls of action, or do you want to give brief remarks now? Whichever one works better for you.
Yeah, we can do, we can, I can share now, and then we can, open up the floor. So yeah, first of all, thank you to CFUW and to Charlotte and Joy and to Khalida for including us in this really important conversation. I think what really comes through for me is the kind of consensus around what needs to change and what needs to be done. We have clear ideas. We know what where the barriers are, and I think have a clear idea of what needs to be done. But also just the fact that really Canadians care about, like, they've been very moved by the plight of Afghans, and they care and they want to make a difference in this. And so to that end, we have tried to create some resources for you that will help you, because I know the question that was just coming for the panelists was, what can Canadians do to help? And you've all done a wonderful, you've made my job really easy, because you've all kind of touched on the many things that I wanted to address. But we get it. The situation is complicated and very dynamic. And I think it was Victoria who spoke about the need to keep ourselves informed, speak within our own networks, share information, talk about the crisis with friends and family and in our own networks. And we just want to make that as easy as possible for you to do. So to that end, we've created some advocacy resources. I'm actually going to share my screen now. This is the Canadian Women for Women in Afghanistan website. I encourage you to visit. We have a dedicated advocacy page. And sorry, I'm just gonna escape full screen so that I can actually access the page. Yeah, so check out the website. We have this list of recommendations that we're calling on IRCC to take action on. I won't review each of them because it's essentially much of what has been discussed already this evening. These have been developed in consultation with a number of stakeholders, including people who are experiencing this on the ground in Afghanistan, but also with many of the panelists who have spoken already here today. So you can click on each one for just a little bit more context about what we're talking about when we say that. So alternative visa documents to replace passports, which are not easily accessible at the moment, the prioritization of SIM applicants, regional hub, the creation of a regional hub, and really kind of working with regional actors to ensure people have safe lily pads to evacuate. Prima facie status, that's come up already. And then an additional one that we have is around kind of waiving the expectation for those entering Canada on student visas to prove their intention to return to the country, because there are a number of student visa applicants who have been approved to attend higher education institutions in Canada and cannot get visas because of this requirement. So you can learn more about those, and then we have actually a letter template that outlines those in more details. You can take that and you can copy paste it in an email to Minister Fraser at IRCC. I think there were questions in the chat about contacting, or there was some discussion about contacting your MPs as well. This can be adapted for that purpose also. And of course, feel free to adapt to fit your own language. And then if you scroll down further, you will find we have some social media assets. I think it was Tim who mentioned the importance of really just amplifying those messages in public facing spaces. The letters are great, but we've also been told by those who are advising us in our advocacy work that that public facing advocacy kind of, tagging the important people, really creating the traffic and amplifying the messages on places like social media can get the attention of mainstream media, and it will really, it's like a great way to kind of remind those in power that Canadians, this is an issue that matters to Canadians, and that basically it's time for us to get loud. So check out the resources there. There are also some sample tweets. You can just copy paste that. Again, we just want to make it as easy for you as possible. So I encourage you to visit our website. I'll also drop the link in the chat. Yeah, check out the resources we have there. We also have like fact sheets and media articles that can give you a backgrounder if you're looking for that. And so visit regularly. We regularly update those resources, and yeah, subscribe to our newsletter if you don't already, and share widely in your networks. And we appreciate the solidarity. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah. And you can tell there's been a lot of work that's gone into that, and a lot of people were asking, what can we do? And so that's all of like that website and that page is definitely a great place to start. So definitely everyone here, please do check that out. And it sounds like from everyone, what we're saying is action items is advocacy. So sending emails, writing letters, and telling stories, adding a personal element of like, why do you care and why you think it's important? That always helps catch people's attention. Amplify organizations' messages on social media. So sharing things, it does make an impact. And you have already like 4 panelists here, 3 panelists here today. And so starting there and sharing those groups' work does go a long way. Talking to your MP, donating to organizations nationally and even in Afghanistan, and educating yourself. Those are all things you can do today to take action. So we'll take maybe 2 or 3 questions from the audience. And for the panelists, if you could keep your answers to maybe 1 or 2 minutes, as short as you can. The first one is for Tim. So Tim, you mentioned that BTN had raised about 2 or 3 million, I think you said, that was primarily used for safe houses. And so what is the status of those safe houses now? And is BTN continuing to raise funds? And if so, for what other purposes?
Yeah, so the primary goal now is the evacuations, trying to support people to get out of the country. The safe houses, there's a few different groups running them during the fall. In November, most of them closed down, and in January, the remaining ones were closed due to a lack of funding. This is an item that was news to a lot of us, that the Canadian government would not fund and would not support. Is basically an international policy that Canadian government has. They do not pay for any housing for people awaiting immigration to Canada. That was a shock to many members of Parliament who were advocating for this program to get funded. and including a lot of us that put a lot of hard work into setting them up. So the remaining funds will be used to try and help people get out of the country when they're eligible. Again, though, this has been complicated by the fact that people are being required to get passports, visas for the countries they're attempting to go to. Again, that's something that is becoming financially difficult. We're seeing prices for a passport go from a few $100s to a few $1,000s US, and no consistent, stable way of getting a hold of one. The visas is another issue, and it seems to change every week. So it's a bit difficult to give any concise advice to people who are in that position, except for to try your best to advise families to get their passport and their proper travel documents. And again, we still, for all the people who are stuck without the approval to come to Canada, you know, it's a very difficult situation, being stuck in a third country, as you know, many people are for years and years on end. That also is a very difficult choice, and that's where we find people are sitting right now, and that's what we can't forget about the families who are staying in Afghanistan, and how can we use advocacy to support them, setting up third location, staging areas. That would be a phenomenal step in the right direction. But keeping this issue alive, keeping this interim authority that's taken power accountable, and show them that this is it's a new century here. Social media is real. The world is watching, and I don't think they're going to get away with the same things they did in the past. And let's remind them of that.
Very well said, Tim. Thank you. The next question is for Ambassador Hassan. Since you were appointed by the previous government prior to the Taliban rule or invasion, what happens to you and your family now? Will you be recalled, and who do you take directions from? And the person who asked the question says, I hope that you and your family can stay safe in Canada.
Thank you for the question. As I just mentioned earlier, of course, we have not had any lines of communication with Kabul since mid-August, but we have remained committed to basically representing the Islamic Republic, representing the people of Afghanistan. And as you know, legally speaking, most of host countries recognize states, not governments. And so in that context, and also given the fact that, as I said, Canada was one of the first countries that basically announced that it would not recognize the Taliban as a government. And as I said earlier, so we have received so much sympathy and support, both from the Canadian government and Friends of Afghanistan over the past few months. And of course, there are some challenges. As I said, we are facing a severe resource constraint. We have been downsizing our missions in Canada. We have 3 missions, the embassy and 2 consulates. But despite all these challenges, we are very much committed to continuing our operations, especially when it comes to the provision of consular services to the newcomers, because that's a very important priority for all of us, and that's part of the post-arrival basically needs. So we are doing well. Thank you so much for your feeling. My family and I are doing well. Our colleagues here in Ottawa, the rest of our colleagues in Vancouver and Toronto, all of them are doing well, and we are very much committed to be the voice of our people. And of course, we are very much lucky to have a very supportive team here at the Global Affairs, and also the same is true with other Canadian institutions and Friends of Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. I think we'll end the Q&A there. We've answered some of the questions in the chat just for the sake of time. Before I pass it on to Joy, I just want to say thank you again to the panelists. It's been an honor to moderate this conversation. Thank you for all the work that you've been doing for Afghans in Afghanistan. Thank you to everyone who's here today for your interest and for caring about this issue. So Joy, I'll pass it on to you for your closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Khalida. I'm Joy Hurst. I'm the Vice President of International Relations for CFUW. First of all, I really want to thank all of our esteemed panelists for taking the time to join us for this important discussion and sharing your unique perspectives on the work that still remains to ensure the safe resettlement of Afghan refugees in Canada and the establishment of peace in Afghanistan. Next, thank you, Khalida, for moderating this session and for truly demonstrating the urgent need to highlight youth voices in this conversation and the inclusion of Afghan and Afghan Canadian youth in all aspects of peacekeeping, human rights, and diplomacy efforts. This is really important because youth really you are our future, and you are now in leadership. And so we do thank you for highlighting the importance of youth leadership. I also must give a vote of thanks to Charlotte Aikens, the CFUW Advocacy Coordinator. Thank you, Charlotte. This session wouldn't be possible without her coordination and all of the work she did to organize it. If you didn't catch Charlotte, she was the person who opened our session. I'd also like to thank the members of the International Relations Committee, because really this webinar was their idea, their brainchild, and they correctly identified that this is an important issue, and they wanted a range of voices and perspectives, and we very much had that this afternoon or this evening, depending where you are. So thank you so much. Truly, it's clear that the humanitarian emergency continues to unfold in Afghanistan and is at a critical crossroads right now. And it does require concerted action from the international community in order to protect human rights. While we're pleased to hear the Canadian government's announcement in August to expedite the settlement of 20,000 vulnerable Afghans to Canada, we believe that Canada has a responsibility to do more and can do more. And this is why CFUW is pleased to co-sponsor a new campaign initiated by Canadian Women for Women and Afghans, with renewed calls to action for Canada to uphold its commitment to resettle vulnerable Afghans and protect their human rights. I want to thank Sarah for those practical tools that you've provided and for the recommendations. CFUW members are very action oriented. They always want to know, okay, what can we do? And so we appreciate the outline of a variety of things and different ways that we can be supportive to the campaign, and also supportive to keeping the pressure on so that there will be changes, and to support not only people coming to Canada, but all the many more people who remain in Afghanistan. So thank you to the panelists. Thank you to everybody. We had 170 participants at one point tonight. We still have 112, which is pretty impressive to see that many still on. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending. Thank you to our panelists and to everybody who's involved in making this a very, very informative session.